Welcome back. All right, so today I'm just going to briefly take you through some quotations that I think are important for our growing understanding of our first novel of the semester, right? Adici's Purple Hibiscus. Oh, so beyond listening to this short video, you also want to make sure that you go into the discussion board for today, right? Again, before midnight, and you are going to be posting in response to the prompts in there. The prompt requirements for today don't have any lengths dictated, so if you want to make them a little bit shorter than usual, that's cool, but just make sure that you're engaging thoughtfully with the people in the conversation and then also with the text itself. So just follow the directions in there, but besides that, let's think about some of the transformation and the development that's going on for our major characters in this second part of the novel. So the first part, we saw a lot of descriptions of how Kambili's world is quite limited, right? She lives a sheltered life, but also a life that is very contained, almost stifling in a way, right? Oppressive. Her and her brother are incredibly silent, right? They don't really play or socialize like kids in their school do. Their entire life is regimented and focused around their father's expectations and focused on really two things, right? School and church. So we see also, that beyond what the outside world sees, right? Where the father is this sort of great member of the community, who has this very honored title and, is able to, in his own way, help fight against the oppressive government and is doing what seems to be a lot of good in the world. At home, right, they're living a very different existence. So we see depictions of violence, which it might be one thing that you might think about is the way that they're described, right? So go back to those scenes. Here's the one where in response to Kambili deciding that she's going to eat a little bit before Mass so that she can take medicine, she's beaten by her father, right? So think about the way that it's described, some of the word choice that Adichie uses in these sections to give yourself a little bit more of an insight into the way that Kambili is coming to terms with who her father is and the life that they live together. Now, a lot of this starts to shift during the appearance of a new character, right? So her aunt, who in this section first visits the home, and then Kambili and her brother go to visit her and her family. So we see at first, because Kambili lives in this world that really centers around her father, the entrance of a character who doesn't really bow down to his authority in exactly the same way is shocking to her, right? And it's not that necessarily she immediately identifies it as a positive thing, which seems really realistic to me. So she exists in this world where she's been, entirely ingrained in her father's influence, and now there's suddenly someone who doesn't speak to him like everybody else does, right? So his sister talks to him just kind of casually. She doesn't always agree with everything he says. She has her own viewpoints, some of which are much more progressive and much less religious than the ones that she's been taught. And Kambili's immediate reaction is that she wants to shut her up, right? Maybe because she's worried about her father reacting negatively, but also just because this is wild to her, right? This idea that somebody would be thinking, not only thinking, but then acting or speaking counter to what her father has deemed correct. Now, notice how if the whole opening, and some of you guys mentioned this nicely or we talked about this nicely in the post on Monday, if the whole opening section is a lot about the silence of their home, right? That they're not really talking about the truth of what their home life is like, how kind of restricted and stifling and violent it is, how Kambili can't really, express her own identity in any way. If that environment is all about silence, right, then the aunt is all about laughter. And that's the description that gets applied to her most often. We also, of course, later get the description of the flowers that she grows in her home, right? So something colorful and rare and vibrant. But notice how her laugh is described, not as beautiful exactly, but Kambili sees it as cackling and throaty and enthusiastic. So it's vibrant, right? It's maybe sometimes even a little bit too much, right? It's cackling. It's a little bit out of control, right? But it's alive. And this is very very, very different from a lot of the descriptors we get of, say, Kimberly's life at home, and also her mother, right, who is very submissive to the father, even to the point of, when it's going to damage her own health. She goes along with what her husband wants and attends the lunch after mass, going to the priest's house, even though she feels ill. And then she's punished for that later by her husband, right? In another scene of violence that gets described in a very opaque kind of or distant kind of way, right? So you could go back and look at the way that's described. Kimberly can't usually, she describes the violence that's going on in their home, but sometimes almost from a distance, right? Without really stating it as explicitly as she could, most likely because she's coming to terms with that reality. So think about the difference between this silence versus laughter, the more progressive views of the aunt versus the father's more traditionalist views, and also, the father's more Western views, and then also the difference between these different gender roles in the story. So we have the mother falling into a more stereotypical submissive female pattern, and the aunt doesn't really abide by that at all. Okay, now if we are thinking about all of the Christian rituals that get described in the early section of the book, right, we get references to communion and to confession. That's matched here by a long description of an Igbo ritual when the kids go and visit and attend this event with their grandfather, their cousins, and their aunt. So take a look at the way that's described, the way that we see Kimberly opening up to the perspective that, there are things outside of what she has been taught. Here we see her very black and white, right? So her aunt tells her that the grandfather is not a pagan, but he's a traditionalist, which we know that words are important, right? And the stories that we tell about different cultures and different beliefs matter. If we think about that TED Talk that we discussed on Monday, but Kimberly is very invested in, neat definitions because that's what she's been taught. So she doesn't get the fine line of this distinction. Pagan, traditionalist, what does it matter? He was not Catholic. That was all. He was not of the faith, right? So she's extremely black and white at this point in her life. We want to see if that shifts over time. But by the end of watching this ritual, which she says is like a painting come to life, she feels pity for her brother that he never got to participate in this ceremony, which signals the movement from boyhood into manhood for members of the community. So we do see this slight shift or opening up in her perspective. All right, we talked about this section. And then the final thing that I want to mention is the big change that we get, right, that we know is going to shift the two central characters' perspectives on their father is their trip to visit their aunt. So pay attention to the way that money and economics and class get emphasized over and over again in this part. So Kimberly is surprised with what they eat. She doesn't know how to do some of the chores that the other kids do. She talks about, the difference in their bathroom, right? And I wonder if this registered to you as just surprise because she comes from a privileged background, or did it ever seem a little snobbish to you or superior? So her cousin definitely thinks that Kimberly is a snob, right? And this is exactly what the kids at school think about her. But we have more access to her, right? So we know that oftentimes she doesn't speak because she can barely get words out of her mouth. You want to think a little bit about why she's so closed off and whether you believe her to be a little bit superior or is she just sheltered? And then finally, how does our new introduction of her cousins, right? So Amako, Abiora, and Shima, how do their characterizations as kids who, play and they have interests and they watch TV and they listen to music and they dress, in less conservative clothing and they speak their minds, right? So how do those characterizations then emphasize or accentuate just how different Kimberly and Jaja are from other people their age, how really closed off and constrained they've been in their experience and also just in the development of their identities because of the way that they've grown up. And you also might think about how the house and the home life gets described just beyond references to money and food. There's definitely, of course, a lot of reference to laughter, and there's a lot of reference to kind of media and exchange of ideas, and then also, of course, to the flowers, which are going to be an important symbol moving forward. Okay, so I think that's all I wanted to say. So now remember, you're going to jump into the discussion boards and think about these ideas a little bit more through your writing. All right, thanks, everybody.